Hey now, RotoGrinders, we are back for week number 2 NFL DFS coverage on RotoGrinders.com. My name is Chris Gimino. I'm joined by Kyle Murray. Kyle, this slate leaves something to be desired in terms of some of the aspects of analyzing who we should be playing in our NFL DFS rosters. But frankly, I'm just happy to be back playing NFL DFS in a classic slate format.
Yeah, definitely. It's a two-gamer, so definitely more of an appetizer for the rest of the weekend. But we have 4 days straight of preseason slate, so it should be a fun one. And like you mentioned, back to classic slate, so no more kickers, but we will now have to roster a tight end, so it gets a little bit uglier there in terms of our certainty of median projections. But hey, like you said, preseason football is back, and it's kind of going to be a next fun 3 or 4 weeks or so leading up to regular season.
If you are not used to playing DFS at the preseason level, let me give you a couple of insights onto how we are going to analyze this that might help you understand why we're choosing the players we're picking. Because, quite frankly, you won't like some of the names that are going to get bandied about throughout the course of preseason coverage. For instance, we are currently focused on identifying on the depth chart who is available to play, who is not available to play, and who the coaches are likely to want to play in preseason. That means the players that you think of as the best for your NFL season long league might be nowhere close to rosters because the coaches are trying to protect them or limiting their playing time. At the same time, coaches will want to play players who are in developmental or in competition modes. And these are the kind of plays that you'll often see when we're talking about NFL DFS. So that should give you some context. Do you have anything else to add to that, Kyle, as far as who and how we're analyzing a slate?
Yeah, another thing is, some coaches are different than others, right? So like some coaches, they want to see the competitions play out on the field in preseason. Some guys really want to be overly cautious with some of their players. So not every team is going to be the same way. Not every team is going to treat veterans or rookies the same way. So it's definitely something that can be tricky at times, especially with new coaches to decipher. But it's part of what makes preseason DFS so exciting and so volatile. But again, sometimes you just have to lean into that volatility, and sometimes you got to lean into being ready to play names that aren't necessarily the most exciting, but which we'll definitely talk about today.
Now, on our website, we have a depth chart tool that will help you try to contextualize who is available to play and who is likely to play, and any notes that we might have on the player as far as what's been stated as far as their playing time is concerned. Opening up the analysis on this slate, Kyle, I think on the Detroit Lions tonight at the quarterback position, we can expect, per Dan Campbell's quotes on how many reps we should expect to see on Hendon Hooker, to be seeing him a lot tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of been a long time coming for Hendon Hooker. A lot of Lions fans and a lot of people in the Lions organization have been excited to see what he can do. And I think this preseason is a great extent of that. When you look at last year, when Jameson Williams was heading into his second year after essentially being injury redshirted the first year, he was suspended for 6 games, and they gave him an extensive look in the first preseason game until he dealt with a hamstring injury. So I'm expecting the same sort of treatment here for Hooker. They don't expect to use him a ton during the regular season, with a healthy Jared Goff. Fingers crossed. So this is a great time to evaluate and give him some, very important reps. So I think we'll see a lot of him throughout the preseason.
The only real competition for snaps here is Sudfeld. Sudfeld is, I hate to say, a veteran of preseason play, but he's been certainly here enough times for us to know pretty much who he is. And I hope the Lions know just the same about him. We shouldn't expect anything more than just really getting his feet wet for the season. They haven't announced his playing time for tonight, but I'm definitely not expecting a whole lot. When you talk about the Carolina Panthers, that is another situation where we can pretty easily narrow down the quarterbacks who are going to be available to play for this game. Bryce Young will not play. That's been announced. Andy Dalton is doubtful, and I would dare say out for reasons of being old and also having a quad injury. So that would leave pretty much just Jack Plummer and Jake Luton available to even see snaps tonight. Luton being a late signing, although he was with the club last year in preseason. But I think it's pretty fair to expect a large chunk of playing time here for Jack Plummer.
Yeah, definitely. And Plummer, obviously, you're probably not going to get a ton of negative words said about you as a young quarterback. But Dave Canales has had some nice things to say about Jack Plummer. And I think the most positive quote that I saw from him was that he's confident that he's going to be able to play good enough football to allow them to develop and analyze other players. And I think that's the most important part here for preseason. They're not expecting Plummer to compete for the starting job or even compete for the backup job, but they're confident in what he can do on the field to allow them to analyze other players, which I think is probably the most important piece of information that I got from Dave Canales from talking about Plummer. Luton was signed very late, 3 days ago, which might be some red flags for him to get playing time. But he's also has some interest, some experience. Sorry, with Dave Canales in the past, so he's probably got a little bit of that playbook under his belt. So I think we could see Luton a little bit, but I think for the most part, Plummer has upside to play 3/4. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he even works into the fourth a little bit, and Luton kind of just finishes out the game. So Plummer, I don't think is an overly sexy play, but he is going to be on the field.
I would say that I have some concerns about Carolina. First of all, this is a low total game. Even for preseason, it's pretty low. And then secondly, the reason for that is because I do believe that both participants in this game are more teams designed to be testing out their run games than their passing games. Albeit New England, you could say something just a little bit different as far as evaluating their quarterbacks are concerned. Ultimately, I do have some concerns that Plummer will not be very efficient in this game. Do like Hooker better than Plummer. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, I think Hooker is kind of the perfect mix of, he has the ability to play a good amount of football here and also has some fantasy upside. He has some rushing upside as well. So, yeah, definitely prefer Hooker over Plummer.
Now, I would not say that the rest of the slate is quite as good as those two guys playing time wise. However, you do have a situation on the Giants where Daniel Jones will not play. Let me refresh this page. I know that we are not expecting to see Daniel Jones in tonight's game per Jordan Renan. So we should then therefore be expecting what, a half from Drew Lock and a half from Tommy DeVito?
I think that's probably the likely outcome where these guys just split the game down the middle. But I will say I do think there's upside for DeVito to maybe play a little bit more. Drew Lock is a guy who they brought in to essentially be their fail safe if Daniel Jones gets hurt. And Daniel Jones is coming back from a knee injury, and they want him back week 1, and they think that is very likely. But I still think Drew Lock, his health is important here, so I wouldn't be surprised to see DeVito maybe get a little bit more than 2 quarters here. I don't think it gets anything crazy where he's playing 3 full quarters or anything like that. I think Drew Lock will play plenty, but if I had to side with one of these guys to maybe get a little bit more than 2 quarters, it would be DeVito, who was pretty prominent in the preseason last year as well.
Drew Lock's definitely got it done in preseason before, so I wouldn't put it past him to do something, especially since the other quarterbacks on the slate not exactly just time-tested, proven options. So I would say that there's a chance here for these New York guys, but I think they're just a half step behind the 2 guys who are more clearly going to play a longer period of time. Now, on the New England side, of course, you have sadly maybe the best quarterbacks on the slate, but also the quarterbacks that are likeliest to split the most. Do you have any takes on what to do here, if anything?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to play any of these guys. If you're playing them, you're hoping that they get it done in a limited time. It sounds like Gerard Mayo is one of those coaches who is going to want to play his starters and then see if they're healthy, they're going to play, is what he said, and that kind of fits the bill with his kind of coaching tree that he's been under in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be the case for some of these even older veteran starters. If that's the case for these quarterbacks, it's probably not going to lead to a lot of playing time. Colin Cowherd came out and proclaimed that Joe Milton's going to be the starter. That doesn't look like it's going to be likely, but he's probably the guy who I would look at behind Drake May in terms of this game. But that's only in 150 lineups. If I'm playing anything less than 150, I'm probably just looking at those 3 other teams for the quarterback play.
We all care what Colin Cowherd has to say about the Patriots quarterback situation. So let's just go ahead and make sure we throw that one in there. Hey, look, I'm following you on the analysis here. So let's get on into the running back position where, Kyle, can we get the bullhorns out to all the dweebs and the geeks out there who love preseason DFS to contact your DraftKings representative and ask them, hey, can we get Sion Vaki added to the player pool? Did I say that name right, Kyle? Because regardless of how you say his name, he looks like one of the best running back players on the slate.
Yeah, I think you got it. He is if he's on the slate, but I thought I would wake up this morning and he would be added. That has not been the case. So now I'm starting to worry about that. We've had a couple of guys in the Discord say that they've contacted DraftKings but haven't heard back yet. But Vaki is the reason why he's not on the DraftKings slate, I would assume, is because of the fact that he's also a defensive player or has been, and there's been question marks about his actual position, but he's a running back on this Lions roster. So, you're trying to cut DraftKings a little bit of slack there because it's a little bit of a weird situation, but nonetheless, they should have had him added by now. I think that they're probably not paying enough attention to this 2-game preseason slate. But Vaki was explosive in college. He was essentially a backup running back there, but he saw spot starts. And, I remember one game where I believe he had 150 rushing yards at half against USC. So, he's definitely a guy with a ton of explosive upside. He would be the top running back for me if they add him. If not, you're going to have to find him over on FanDuel. But that would be an unfortunate scenario if he's not added to the DraftKings pool.
Just breaking down the thought process there, we don't expect Craig Reynolds to really get a whole lot of run here. He's basically cemented into his spot. I don't think the Lions are going to want to see that evaluation. Bam Knight is also someone who we expect to see quite a bit of in this game. Jefferson has been around this team long enough for me to suspect that he will not get a lot of burn, although I do expect to see him. And Jake Funk is more of a third down scat type of a back and not someone that we can expect to see significant volume from. Any disagreements there?
No, I guess the one thing that I would say from a strategy perspective is if they don't add Vaki to DraftKings, I do think it's well known enough about him and him being absent from the pool to where people might still avoid some of these Lions backs. I think Bam Knight, Zonovan Knight will probably be the most popular one if Vaki isn't added, but you could arguably just use this as a strategy standpoint. If you're playing both sites, especially, you can go into the DraftKings slate assuming, maybe Vaki won't be the lead back. Maybe he won't be the guy getting the touches, and you can kind of approach that Lions back a little bit differently because they are still a bit thin. And Jefferson, although they have seen him, he's been on the team for 3 or 4 years now and, been on the team in preseason. He is reportedly having some explosive upside plays in camp and maybe showing a little bit more ability to compete for this RB3 role. So maybe he gets a little bit more burn. So he could be a dart throw in tournaments that I would be looking at. But other than that, I still do think Vaki and Knight are more likely to be the guys who perform better in this game.
I promise this slate was a little ambiguous, Kyle, and I think we're starting to get to the ambiguous part, and it's only going to get worse from here. Okay, so getting into some of the other teams and their running back situations. Look, I can't say that I know exactly for sure what the Panthers are going to do, but I will say this: if Brooks not available, not playing, you don't expect Hubbard. You don't really expect Miles Sanders. That basically is pushing a lot of snaps to Blackshear and Boone because these other two guys, frankly, look like they stink.
Yeah, Dylan Johnson, who you pointed out in our internal Slack that he was already cut from one team this offseason or this preseason, and he was signed about a little over a week ago to the Panthers. Johnson was good in college, but he's also a little bit of an older running back and guy who's bounced around in college, and then obviously like we talked about already, been cut already in the preseason. Blackshear, who's a guy who's had a lot of preseason success, as is Mike Boone, two guys who've kind of been MVP darling type players in the preseason in years past, are two guys that I think could be interesting. Blackshear is the one guy I think carries a little bit more risk just because I think he's going to have a role on this team come the regular season. Sounds like Brooks is going to miss the first month of the season. Miles Sanders, I still think he's like a sneaky cut candidate, and he's always hurt anyway. So Blackshear is a guy who's going to have a role in the return game potentially, and maybe even a role as a runner in this Carolina offense. So I wouldn't be surprised if they may be a little bit more careful with Blackshear, but nonetheless, he's still currently the 4th running back on the depth chart when you're looking at their overall season. So he could easily get some work. So Blackshear and Boone are the guys that I like the most for Carolina. Sheridan is a very small, shifty type guy who might be able to catch some passes, but overall, I don't think he's going to be a guy who necessarily gets a lot of consistent playing time.
Yeah, definitely a little bit tougher to call there. I'll probably play some Blackshear, but it's just like, I don't feel great about it. Tyrone Tracy Jr. is someone who's going to be very popular on tonight's slates, Kyle. He's been getting a lot of buzz in the best ball streets as far as a late round pick is concerned, currently being projected at the number 2 running back position in a lot of places for this team. Now, I think Eric Gray, Dante Miller are going to be spending their preseason time trying to maybe see if they can change that opinion as far as what the coaches are thinking. But at the end of the day, I do think Tracy will be popular. Is it going to be a good play in preseason DFS?
Yeah, I think Tracy's pretty interesting. It does sound like he has this RB2 and maybe even a third down role handled pretty securely as of the moment for this Giants offense. So that might bring a little bit of room for pause there, considering that it doesn't look like they're playing any of their starters or important pieces in this game. But again, I think Tracy still has a lot to prove. Keep in mind, just 2 years ago, he was a receiver for Iowa. He transferred over to Purdue, played running back. So this is a guy still learning the position. So I think these preseason reps can be very important for Tracy. And I do think that he's going to be able to be used in the passing game quite a bit. And we have two quarterbacks who have had connections with him so far in this training camp out of the backfield. And I think in preseason is just a great environment to find some checkdowns. I really would not be surprised if we see 3 or 4 catches out of Tracy in this game. I know that's a high number in terms of a preseason number, but again, I do think this is a spot where they could look to get him design screens, design targets, because he's going to have a role come regular season, according to all signs so far here for training camp for the Giants.
I think Miller's the guy that I'm looking at as like the pivot option off of Tracy in this particular backfield. But again, I would not have a lot of conviction on anything I'm saying about most of the rest of the players we're going to talk about on this slate. I do think it's really close, and ultimately it's going to be up to you to influence a little bit of your own takes as far as where you think the chips might fall here on tonight's slate. Now, at the New England Patriots backfield, we really can't rule out Stevenson and Gibson the same way that we can rule out other starters, because the coaches did say that the starters will participate in this game. The amount that they'll participate is something that's left to projection and speculation at this point in time. But in the assumption that it wasn't a lot, you could find something to like about maybe the back end of this chart, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that I'm going to, approach the situation for my personal lineups is that Gibson and Stevenson are essentially going to split a drive or two, and these guys can both get it done. If they have a scoring drive, Stevenson could easily be, the guy to find the end zone. And it sounds crazy, but 1 touchdown can, definitely be a guy who is in the top 3 of a position. And obviously with 2 running backs and a flex play to roster, he can definitely be, rosterable even with just a few touches and a touchdown. So Stevenson and Gibson are obviously going to have projections for us, but I'm still not convinced that they play a ton. It really doesn't make sense for them to play Stevenson a whole lot. I mean, he's essentially their most important player on their offense right now. They just paid him a ton of money. It's already a volatile position with a lot of injury risk. So I'd be surprised to see him play a ton there. So I'm expecting a quarter or two for that, or a drive or two for them. And after that, Harris, Hasty, and Jennings are the guys to probably split some time. For me, I prefer Hasty out of these guys. He's new to the team. He's a guy who we've seen rumors about, potentially having to fight for a roster position here. Harris sounds like he's in the lead for the RB3 role. So I think Hasty's going to be the guy who not only gets playing time, but also I think it just has the most explosive playability. He's the fast, shifty pass-catching running back. So he's the guy that I'm looking at for the Patriots running backs.
Wide receiver, Kyle, this is going to be tough. We actually have to play 3 of these guys tonight. Can you believe that?
Yeah, it's
so,
going to be tough.
So that's going to be an interesting situation to try to figure out how you're going to actually play many lineups on this slate and decide multiple guys that you want to play in many lineups, because quite frankly, it's a little scary. So the thinnest depth chart, I think, is the Carolina Panthers. Now, the problem with the Carolina Panthers is they have Jack Plummer and Jake Luton out there chucking the rock to these guys. And these guys, I mean, I don't want to say they're not very good, because actually they kind of are at the top of the depth chart, but you're not so convinced that we're going to see a lot of Mingo, Marshall kind of lineups out there, right? I mean, you're thinking we're going to be seeing more of the back end of this chart.
Yeah, definitely. And that all comes down to how they're treating Bryce Young. Canales said that he's not competing for the job anymore, so he doesn't need to play. He's still obviously a young guy, but he doesn't need the developmental reps. So they're going to, proceed with caution, essentially, with Bryce Young. And that's the same sort of thing that I get from Marshall and Mingo. They're young guys, but it sounds like Mingo with Leggett out is the current wide receiver 3. It might even be the wide receiver 3 if Leggett is healthy, just due to inexperience for Leggett there. Marshall got banged up a little bit in practice earlier this week. He returned, so it doesn't sound like anything serious. But again, I just think that these are guys who they know what they have, and they're going to have roles come the regular season. So, if they're treating all their other players like that, I sort of feel like that Mingo and Marshall could be looped into that sort of category where they're guys who have their roles. They're going to have spots on the team come regular season. So I don't expect to see them a lot. And even if we do, I don't think it'll be enough to where it's going to hinder other players playing time. So I think it's going to be really clear at the back end of the step chart. It's going to see some playing time. me and you have discussed it a lot. I think they're going to play a lot, and obviously they're going to probably be pretty inefficient because this offense doesn't project to be all that efficient, even from a preseason standard here. The guys that stand out to me are Amir Smith-Marset. He's probably at the top of the list right now. I personally have some interest in Devin Tompkins just because of his connection with Canales. He's had the slot receiver role kind of figured out as he's played with Canales in Tampa Bay the past couple of years. So I think we could maybe see him get some time in the slot, and that could be a beneficial role. He's also, the fast, shifty type player, which I think typically translate pretty well to preseason. So those are the two guys that I like the most. But I think Amir Smith-Marset and David Strachan are the two guys that are probably most projectable, guys who have had solid NFL careers so far and might be able to have some production here in this preseason game.
Yeah, normally you can count me out on Devin Tompkins from Jake Luton connections and stacks. I think you have to at least open your mind to what's going on at the back end of this Panthers depth chart, but it's pretty ugly. But Kyle just laid it out for you pretty nicely as far as what the situation is there. The Lions have a lot more bodies on their depth chart, but of course, many of them you can rule out instantly. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, probably Khalif Raymond can be ruled out. I mean, I don't think you can say that we've heard that for sure, but I mean, I think at this point in time, Campbell has said he wants to leave out the veterans and the starters from this game. So that, in theory, leaves the ongoing wide receiver 3 battle as the place to target. At least that's my point of view. What do you think about that?
Yep, I agree on Raymond. I don't think we see him. I think he's not necessarily in the wide receiver 3 camp here because he has his own unique role on this offense, kind of coming in off the bench and doing stuff on the return side of things, and he's more of a slot guy. But in terms of this wide receiver 3 role, like you mentioned, it's Green, Fountain, who sounds like he's leading the charge right now in terms of this current job, and then Donovan Peoples-Jones, who sounds like he's pretty far behind. So those are the 3 guys that I think are in that battle. Green and Fountain are the 2 Lions receivers that I have the most interest in. I also have some interest in Caden Davis, who's made some big plays in camp and has had some connections here with Hendon Hooker. So those are the 3 Lions receivers that I personally like the most, but I do think that Green and Fountain are the 2 that probably stick out amongst the group.
I think a lot of people would have started this slate talking about the Patriots wide receivers, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker, who have been absolutely showing out in camp. And you see all these reports coming across your Twitter timeline. Yes, I'm really excited. Let's go. Well, not so fast, Kyle. How are we going to handle this situation? Because Polk at this point may have actually played himself out of undue risk here in the preseason, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a scenario that we've kind of flip-flopped a bit back and forth in terms of the projections here, where he's a young guy. He could probably use the reps. They're already committed to playing some of their starters, although it sounds like it's probably going to be not all that extensive of playing time. But Polk, it also sounds like he might have just solidified himself as the top 2 receiver on this team, and there's no need to really risk any injury by pushing him any later in the game than the rest of these starters. So if Jacoby Brissett and Ramondre Stevenson are playing 1 to 2 series, sounds like Polk might be right in there with that group, and obviously, tracking some stuff on Prize Picks and underdog lines as well. His line has dropped significantly, so Polk's a guy that we dropped in projection, and it sounds like it's going to be due to him simply winning out a starting wide receiver job and then wanting to be cautious with him going forward.
Now, we certainly don't have any more information than the rest of you as far as how much Polk is going to play tonight. So keep in mind, he could certainly go out there, especially in one drive, and end your night. Right? If he plays as well as he's been playing in camp, that could easily happen. But at the same time, we like to try to find the players that we're more confident are going to be on the field for the most time. And it does look like Polk has at least some probability of being more limited than some of the other players. Of course, they have a deep depth chart here at wide receiver, lots of players who could actually play in this game. It's fair to say that if you were going to look at players off of, say, Jalen Polk, down deeper down the depth chart, would you go to Baker or would you go to this ongoing wide receiver 5 battle?
Yeah, Baker's the guy that I like the most. I just think he's a good mix of wanting to see him because he's a younger guy, 4th round pick, but he's also a guy who they might be able to develop a little bit more in these preseason games because he's had some concerns in camp with consistency, but it sounds like he's been a guy with tremendous upside in relation, I guess, in comparison to Patriots wide receivers, but also a guy who's had a lot of inconsistency, drop passes, missed routes and all that stuff. So he could use these key developmental snaps. After that, it gets gross. There's a group of 4 guys who are all guys that we've talked about in the past with Thornton, Rieger, Booty, and Juju there, who all might be cut candidates and all have potentially, their life on the line in this game. But it's difficult because the depth chart is so deep here. So I think Baker's the one guy that stands out. You could argue that these receivers, you could want to throw a dart at these receivers because they're arguably going to have the best quarterbacks throwing them passes throughout the game. All these quarterbacks, obviously outside of Milton and May, with Zappy and Brissett having NFL experience, May being a third overall pick, and Milton getting some buzz in camp. All of them have had no reason to think that they can be a guy to help a receiver produce some solid stat lines here. So I think the ones that I'm looking at the most right now are probably Baker and then maybe Kayshon Boutte, just because of the fact that it sounds like he is really on the edge of making the team and could use this as a kind of a showcase game here.
Giants wide receiver room is definitely a little bit tougher to call. You can make a case for some of these guys. Are you ready to make a case for any of these guys?
Not particularly. It's kind of ugly here in terms of this is a mix of not a ton of exciting names, but also a lot of question marks. Like you have Allen Robinson, Isaiah McKenzie, Isaiah Hodgins, all guys who have been in the league for more than a few years, and you don't really know the willingness to want to play these guys, but they're also all either wide receiver 6 or lower in the depth chart, or wide receiver 5 or lower in the depth chart, I should say. Jalen Hyatt's a big question mark. I don't think Jalen Hyatt plays all that much, honestly. I think he's going to be probably the wide receiver 3 coming into the season, and he's a young guy who they probably want to keep healthy. And there's been joint practices here for this Giants team, so I don't think there's a huge need to go out and run out Jalen Hyatt. So Hodgins and McKenzie are probably 2 guys that I think could be interesting, but McKenzie's been dealing with some injuries. He did return to the joint practices a few days ago, but he's been banged up over the past couple of weeks. So he's a guy that I think they might take easy on just because of the injury. So Hodgins, as weird as it sounds, he might be a guy who gets some playing time, but also has a decent amount of skill here. So I guess Hodgins would be the guy that sticks out to me, but it's pretty ugly here for the Giants.
We can speak a little bit more confidently about their tight end room. This is a situation where I actually think we can feel pretty confident with how thin they are that we're going to see certain players on the field.
Yeah, definitely. Theo Johnson is a guy that they were really excited about going into the draft. They took him in the 4th round, and it sounds like he has a really good chance to be their starter. But I don't know if it's necessarily been 100% proven yet. So this could be a great time for him to solidify that role. And I think that also leaves him in a good spot from a preseason perspective to where he hasn't necessarily locked down that starting role yet. So they're not necessarily going out of their way to protect him, and they're still looking for him to prove it. But then you also have Lawrence Cager, Chris Manhertz, Jack Stoll, all guys who have been dealing with injury. Manhertz did get banged up, but he returned the next day. But he's an older veteran guy. I don't think they're necessarily desperate to see him get snaps. I think it comes down to Theo Johnson being in a good spot to prove his role as the potential tight end 1 here. And then Tyree Jackson is a former quarterback we've seen in preseason the past couple of years, but playing tight end for the Eagles. But he's a guy who's a big body, could potentially be a really interesting red zone threat. So those are the 2 tight ends that stick out the most. I don't think we see much, if any, of Daniel Bellinger.
Of course, there are tight end pivots on this slate. On Carolina, for instance, I think there's been a lot of buzz going around about Jatavian Sanders. Do you expect that we'll see him enough in this game to be interested?
I do, yeah. He's another guy, again, who I don't think is going to be thrusted into an early starting role here. They have Tommy Tremble. They have Ian Thomas, who they've used in situational different situations over the past couple of years there. So they don't necessarily need to play Sanders a ton early on in the regular season, and this could be great for him to get some developmental snaps and kind of prove what he's capable of on the field. He's had a really interesting training camp, a ton of big plays. I think I've seen tweets about him pretty much every single day talking about this incredible touchdown grab, this incredible catch. So I think Sanders is a very exciting prospect coming out of Texas there, and he's definitely going to be the guy in Carolina who, again, dealing with some injuries. Tremble has a calf hamstring injury. Ian Thomas has a calf injury. And then they have a host of guys that were just signed, and Jesper Horsted and Jacob Hollister, 2 guys that we've seen in the league pretty consistently the past few years, but both just signed on the 5th. So probably not going to see a ton of playing time from them.
Last name of the tight end position is your guy, Bell of New England. Give the people a little bit of a breakdown. Why are you so excited about Bell?
Yeah, Jaheim Bell is one of those guys who he's just an athletic freak, right? Coming out of college, he played his last year at Florida State, put up a very impressive stat line there for a team that essentially didn't have a quarterback for the last 7 or 8 games. Had over 600 receiving yards, played a lot from the slot there, caught a few touchdowns. But the year before that, I believe it was South Carolina that he was on. He was playing running back and tight end for his team. So he's a guy who's just an extreme athlete. He can play in the slot. I'm not saying the Patriots are going to use him as a running back, but I think that he could be a guy who's used in the slot. He did get banged up a little bit, but returned to practice and apparently caught an exceptional touchdown in the back corner of the end zone from Drake May in his first day returning back from that injury. So Jaheim Bell, I think, is just one of those guys who's simply an athlete that kind of just stands out from that perspective compared to the rest of these tight ends. So I think he's going to be a guy that's on my list for sure.
On RotoGrinders.com, we have our lineup HQ tool where you can find our preseason tiered projections throughout the entire preseason. And of course, that includes defenses. Today, Kyle, why don't you give people a breakdown of how we're looking at defenses you can target in DFS contests?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because, from a preseason perspective, playing time can sort of be king. So like you'll see a pretty good projection on Jack Plummer, but from a overall experience and production standpoint, you can also argue that Jack Plummer is the worst quarterback that's going to be on the field for the majority of the game. So that's why you see the Patriots defense have a pretty good projection there. Same thing goes for the Lions defense, two guys who have had NFL playing time, but also have been pretty turnover prone at times. So we rank them Patriots and then the Lions with the Giants behind them. I'm pretty high on Hendon Hooker personally, and I think that this is going to be a team that is probably going to run the ball a little bit as well there for the Lions. So Giants are third, and then rounding out the Panthers, in terms of teams that we have the least amount of interest in, it's probably the Patriots in terms of rostering their players. But that's because they're playing a lot of their key players and their starters. So that's going to overall just hurt the Panthers. And obviously also taking these Vegas lines into account, with the Panthers being 7-point underdogs and whatnot. So that's kind of how we rank them right now.
That's going to do it for the Thursday slate breakdown. Come check us out tomorrow. We're going to do one for Friday as well. For Kyle Murray, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll be back again very soon. Preseason DFS on RotoGrinders.